never forget that elections have consequences. For one city in Nebraska, they're learning that shit the hard way. Curtis, Nebraska has a population of 806. Just the kind of place with a single traffic light, one health clinic, and a fuck ton of American flags. And in 2024, over 85% of them voted for Donald Trump. Now, their only medical clinic is shutting down by September 30th of this year. It's the kind of place people went for everything. For checkups, blood work, urgent care, you name it, that's where they went. And once it's gone, they'll be looking at a 40-mile round trip just to see a doctor. So who have they decided to blame? Not Trump, not the Republican Party. They're blaming the hospital executives. Like this is some sort of isolated business failure and not the direct result of the GOP's big, beautiful bill that gutted Medicaid and rural healthcare funding. That bill slashed nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid. Small-town hospitals like Curtis's, they were the first ones thrown under the bus. And the GOP knew it was coming. And now look where these people are. Sick, stranded, and still making excuses for the guy who signed their death warrant. But this is the cost of voting for the con man, guys. Your taxes don't get you care. Your vote doesn't get you help. It just buys you a slower, more painful collapse. So when you say you support law and order and protecting life, but watch your hospital close down under a president you put back in power, you're not just a voter. You're the getaway driver.
This is not something that farmers can work around. No one anticipated that we would have a shock to the system. All the experts did not see this coming when we see this rise in fertilizer prices because of this war.
Nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody thought that electing Donald Trump to go on a revenge path and do whatever he wants completely unchecked would lead to this. Nobody said anything. Kamala Harris didn't say anything. The people on social media, the liberals, the Democrats, the sensible independents, anybody with more than 2 brain cells didn't see this coming. We all saw this coming. We knew there was going to be a war. We knew there was going to be a conflict. We knew that his idea.
Rural healthcare in America was already under significant pressure before the most recent round of federal spending cuts. Small hospitals in communities like Curtis, Nebraska operate on margins so thin that any reduction in Medicaid reimbursements can be the difference between staying open and shutting down. These facilities are not closing because of poor management or bad business decisions. They are closing because the financial model that keeps them viable depends on federal support that is now being removed. And unlike urban hospital systems that can absorb cuts through volume and diversified revenue streams, a single clinic town has no fallback. When that clinic closes, the healthcare infrastructure of the entire community disappears at once. A community that voted at 85% for the candidate whose legislative agenda directly produced the clinic's closure is now experiencing the consequence of that vote in the most personal and physical way possible. The instinct to blame hospital executives rather than the policy environment that made the closure inevitable reflects the same pattern visible across farming communities, construction businesses, and manufacturing towns. A reluctance to connect the governing decisions of supported leaders to the outcomes those decisions produce. That connection does not require political sophistication. It requires only a willingness to follow the chain of cause and effect from Washington to the waiting room that no longer exists.
Maybe y'all saw the news out of Nebraska today. Apparently our entire state is going to go bankrupt in 2 quarters. Me and my husband owned a cattle ranch here, and I can confirm that all of the cattle ranchers here overwhelmingly voted for Trump. We support him. We voted for him. Something like 70% of our entire workforce is undocumented immigrants, and they straight up are not showing up for work anymore. They have all either fled the country, fled the state. They don't want to get raided while at work, so they have just moved on to work somewhere else. And straight up, we are going to go bankrupt now. We are going to go bankrupt, and yeah, we voted. We knew that the immigrants would get deported and he was coming after immigrants, yet we still voted for it. Overwhelmingly voted for our own demise. I was talking to my husband last night, and I have to admit that it seems a bit foolish now when you think about it like that we voted for something that is now putting us directly out of business.
Just a week ago, it would have only cost me about $58 to fill my truck up.
It cost $70.
I don't have a good feeling about this.
I just got back from Hy-Vee because I had to get a few things to cook with tonight, and It is sickening on how expensive things are. I don't drink pop, and if I do, it's like 0 sugar. But I saw a 12-pack of pop is like $9. I was like, are you kidding me? It is absolutely insane on how expensive things are. When is stuff going to go down in price? Like, my God, it shouldn't be this expensive.
The cattle rancher speaking here is doing something that is both rare and important. She is applying honest cause and effect reasoning to her own political choices without deflecting the responsibility onto someone else. The acknowledgement that they knew immigration enforcement was central to the platform they voted for, and that their business depended on the very workforce that enforcement would remove, is a moment of genuine accountability that is difficult to arrive at and even more difficult to say publicly. What this account also reveals is the structural contradiction at the heart of the agricultural economy in states like Nebraska, the industry that defines the state's economic identity, that is celebrated in its political culture, and that anchors the livelihoods of families who have farmed the same land for generations, depends fundamentally on a workforce that exists in a legal gray area. That dependency did not develop by accident. It developed over decades because the labor was available, the work was hard, the pay was low, and nobody in a position of political power had a genuine incentive to resolve the underlying legal framework. The result is an agricultural sector that is simultaneously one of the most politically conservative in the country and one of the most structurally dependent on the immigrant labor that conservative immigration policy now targets.
So maybe this is another unpopular opinion, but I feel like you should have to live with the repercussions of your vote. And if you don't want to live with the repercussions of your vote, maybe you should actually vote a different way. But if you do vote that way, then you should have to live with that repercussion of your vote. And if it causes you to go to bankrupt and for you to lose everything, then so be it. That is on you. So I hope going forward that you've learned from this and that you will vote a different way and vote for something that actually is for your best interest. Most likely you probably won't. I guess we'll see.
Nebraska, we have to talk about the state budget. Last year, the state was in a deficit of $400 million. This year, it's in a deficit of $600 million, and the projections are already that next year it'll top over $800 million in the red. When Nebraska came out of the pandemic, we had a surplus. We had a surplus of $1.9 billion in just 2 or 3 years' time. Now we are bleeding for cash. Now, the governor's office would tell you to ignore your eyes and ignore your ears, and that we're rich, that we don't have to worry about our state budget, that we can just keep raiding savings and that eventually it'll all work out. That is a fiscally irresponsible message. That is the wrong way to manage a budget, and we need something different in the legislature and in leadership in Nebraska. The state legislature decided coming out of the pandemic that it wasn't going to invest in economic growth, it wasn't going to invest in working Nebraskans, but it was going to do a few things. It was going to build a new prison for over $400 million. It was going to work on building a canal out in Colorado, which it's now fighting in the United States Supreme Court. It is going to cut corporate taxes and income taxes for the top earners. The state made its priorities. A budget is a moral document and it shows where your allegiances lie. In terms of our states, the allegiances of state lawmakers lie with the prison industry. They lie with corporations and making sure that they're able to get off with a new tax break. They don't lie with working Nebraskans. We are now in this budget deficit and lawmakers are looking around for piles of money and programs that they can cut. So they raided the Veterans Aid Fund. The Veterans Aid Fund is a fund created by the state that helps veterans come back and reassimilate into civilian life. It helps veterans who have PTSD, who are suffering from disabilities due to their service. They went after services for disabled Nebraskans, even disabled kids. They went after the Department of Health and Human Services and our Medicaid funds that ensures the most vulnerable Nebraskans are able to go to the doctor and get the health care that they need. Our state lawmakers had the wrong budget priorities. We need to balance our budget, but that means addressing the structural deficit. That means going back and creating a tax code that's fair, that doesn't overwhelmingly burden working Nebraska.
The sentiment expressed here is blunt, but it points to a genuine tension in democratic accountability. On one hand, the principle that voters bear responsibility for the consequences of their choices is foundational to how democratic governance is supposed to function. If there are no personal consequences for supporting policies that produce harmful outcomes, then The feedback loop that is supposed to correct bad governance breaks down. On the other hand, the people suffering the most severe consequences in communities like Curtis, Nebraska, are not always the people who held the most power or had the most information when the vote was cast. A ranch hand who lost his job did not cast a ballot. A child who cannot see a doctor because the clinic closed did not vote for the bill that closed it. This tension does not resolve neatly, but it does clarify what accountability actually requires beyond simply absorbing consequences quietly. It requires naming what produced those consequences, connecting the policy to the outcome in public, and using that understanding to make different decisions going forward. The question is whether the clarity that comes from personal economic devastation will persist long enough to shape the next election, or whether it will fade as political identity reasserts itself once the immediate crisis passes.
It's Joe from Georgia. So we're getting ready for the first domino to fall, and we know what happens after the first one falls. Well, the state of Nebraska, the governor, Jim Pillen, has asked the federal government for help because they're not going to be able to pay their bills this year. And here's the problem in Nebraska. They had over a $2 billion contract with the Chinese government to export soybeans to China. Well, out of that $2 billion, they've canceled all the contracts. So out of that $2 billion, $350 million was state revenue taxes. They're not getting any of that. And the governor also goes on to say that because the migrant farmers weren't able to work in Nebraska this summer, that those people didn't pay their taxes either. And the farmers who already have crops in the ground, folks, they've already spent their money. They're going to need help too because they're not getting any money from the contracts anymore. So Nebraska is the first state. And when you look at the Midwest, you're probably looking at Kansas, you're looking at Iowa, South Dakota, all of those places that are large exporters of grains to China and depend on migrant farm labor. They're not going to be able to pay their bills either. So here's the first one to fall. But of course, as we do know, a certain person in a certain house in Washington, D.C. at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, they know all about bankruptcy. I'm sure they'll be able to help.
The financial crisis facing Nebraska is a direct illustration of how trade policy and immigration enforcement, when pursued simultaneously without coordination or regard for downstream consequences, can produce cascading economic damage that reaches into state budgets, farm operations, and local tax bases all at once. A $2 billion agricultural export contract with China does not get replaced overnight. The crops that were planted in anticipation of that revenue were already in the ground before the contracts were canceled. The money was already spent. The loss cannot be undone by a policy reversal because the growing season does not wait for trade negotiations to conclude. The tax revenue dimension adds another layer of compounding damage. When migrant workers leave a state because enforcement makes their presence too dangerous, the taxes they would have paid on their wages leave with them. Those contributions, often invisible in political discussions about immigration, are real and measurable components of state revenue that fund schools, roads, emergency services, and the administrative infrastructure that everyone in the state depends on. When that revenue disappears suddenly, the gap does not close on its own. It requires either new revenue sources, service cuts, or emergency federal assistance. And in Nebraska's case, the state is now seeking that federal help from the same administration whose policies created the need for it.
So Trump supporters, if you're not worried now about the economy, now is the time to be worried. Nebraska, Tyson Foods. They're the largest meat producer in the country. They're closing their Nebraska beef processing plant because of Trump economics. Cattle costs have risen $2 billion because of Trump's tariffs, and it has resulted in a net loss of $425 million in 2025 to date for Tyson Foods. So they're closing their meat packing plant, and 3,200 employees in this small town with only 11,000 residents are losing their jobs. 3,200 employees, and I can guarantee a vast majority voted for this. And it doesn't end there. Tyson is taking their 3-shift slaughter operation in Texas down to 1 shift. So a lot more people at their Texas facility are going to be let go. When you talk about big industries now being affected, not the small guy, but those at the top of the food chain being impacted and closing down, we are in a world of economic hurt. And this is just the beginning, because this Trump administration is not focused on fixing the problem. They keep creating more. And I got to tell you, just this Tyson food location in Nevada, there are so many suppliers, so many vendors, contractors every single day that did work for this Tyson facility, whether inside the building or outside the building. These are big contracts that these local businesses are now going to lose. So they're going to be affected as well. Expect more layoffs and bankruptcies downstream of Tyson Foods.
Interconnected failures that begins with policy decisions in Washington and ends in the daily lives of people who had no direct role in making those decisions. A rural clinic closing because Medicaid funding was cut. A cattle ranch facing bankruptcy because its workforce has been driven away by enforcement operations. A state government unable to meet its financial obligations because export contracts were canceled and tax revenue disappeared alongside the workers who generated it. And now a processing plant closing, putting 3,200 people out of work in a town of 11,000, with the ripple effects spreading to every business that depended on that plant for its own survival. These are not separate stories. They are chapters in the same story, connected by the same thread, a set of governing decisions made without serious consideration of how they interact with the economic realities of the communities they affect most. Tariffs that raise cattle costs do not exist in isolation from the processing plants that turn cattle into beef. Immigration enforcement that removes farm labor does not exist in isolation from the crops that depend on that labor or the tax revenue that workers generate. Medicaid cuts do not exist in isolation from the rural hospitals that serve communities with no other options. Each decision pulls on the same web, and the tension travels in every direction at once. Nebraska voted for this administration at rates well above the national average. The communities now absorbing these consequences are, in most cases, the same communities that delivered that support. That is not a reason to dismiss their pain. It is a reason to take seriously the question of how governing decisions are evaluated before they are made, and how accountability functions when the consequences arrive. The question worth sitting with is this: when a state's hospitals, farms, export contracts, and major employers are all destabilized simultaneously by the policies of an administration that state helped put in power, what does it take for that record to finally be the thing that determines what comes next?